I want to welcome our students to this second session in which we're going to deal with questions that you've submitted to me and to Dr. Brokaw. And we had 6 in the last session. We have 6 more in this session. And so we want to walk through some of these. And as we've prepared, we've talked about the fact that, there are resources available to us, and we'll be referring to some of those. And there's ones that you could probably find that are similar, maybe even in the library at the college right now. So that's always a good place to look as well. So let's jump into our first question for today, and it's right.
First question.
I'll read it. It's read this way. In the Old Testament, we hear people marrying more wives, and in the book of Titus, we are told of one wife. As leaders, we are asked about these two scenarios. Would you comment on these? That's a good question. I mean, that's one of the things that I didn't know as much about till I made a trip to Zimbabwe and was learning more about the culture that polygamy had been such a big issue, especially as missionaries came in and during the 20th century. And so that would be a valid question, right? And something that we in the United States almost never face. So it's good to think through that. I've got a few scriptures I want to put on the screen, and then we can talk through some answers to that. So let me share my screen, and I really just want to get these in front of us, and then Dr. Brokaw and I can both talk a little bit about this. So if we go back to Genesis 2, 22 to 24, this is what we read. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." And it seems to me that this is a place that scripture says this is what marriage should look like, okay? They shall become one flesh. And as I read that, it's hard to imagine that making sense with multiple spouses, right? If you're one flesh, that can't be shared with someone else. Then we could look at teaching from Jesus in Matthew 19. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" Jesus says, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." So they are no longer two, but one flesh. And it continues, "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." So Jesus quotes a lot of what we just read, or refers to it from Genesis. And then in Ephesians, we have Paul saying similar thing. "In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for the body, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So, okay, what we do with that, I mean, what we have is the instructions at creation that seem to refer to two people becoming one flesh. And it doesn't make sense that that involves more than those two people. We have Jesus referring to the same thing, and Jesus talks about more in that passage for sure that we don't really have time to deal with. But that's still the model of one man, one woman. And certainly Paul compares it to the church, of Jesus and the church, the bride of Christ, and then says, hey, this is sort of like marriage, right? Two made one. Now, so why would we see in the Old Testament that, several people who have more than one wife? And why did God allow that? I don't know that we have a great answer to that question, but what I do know is that it seems like this is the model, one man, one woman making one flesh. God seems to have allowed some other things, but that was never his plan for real marriage. And we brought back to that in the New Testament, one man, one woman. So I think that's the clear practice that God's called us to, and maybe he allowed something else in the Old Testament for whatever reason. I don't know that I have a good answer to that, but all we can do is bring this back to what seems to be the biblical model for what marriage looks like. Okay, Dr. Brokaw, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I was trying to find the passage because I believe the question references Titus, right?
Yeah, and I did not read from Titus. You're right.
In terms of instructions of being the husband of one wife.
Right.
And as usual, here it is. Chapter 1, verse 6 of Titus, and I think something like this is repeated in some of the other passages.
Right.
An elder must be blameless, the husband of but one wife.
Right.
A man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Going back to the Old Testament, John Goldingay in his New Testament for Everyone translates what has traditionally been translated as concubine as secondary wives. We can't really fully comprehend, as you said, why God allows it in the Old Testament, although it was the very common practice in the day in the Middle East. And it was almost in some cases it's almost essential for the for women who had no other means of support,
right,
and for children who might have been brought into a situation in which there were no other means of support. But clearly God allows it because of the culture. Now, this text in Titus is one that gets discussion in churches today about can an elder in our culture who's been divorced and remarried be an elder, right? What does Paul mean? Is Paul talking about polygamous situations, or is he talking about divorce? Our church eventually took the stand is too strong, took the opinion that a man who had been married, divorced, remarried could be an elder under certain circumstances. There has to be repentance, and there has to be growth of maturity,
right?
Afterwards, that he's demonstrating the qualities of being an elder. And then our churches have tended to highlight that one, and then the next one, whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient, we've just kind of skipped over.
Yeah, because who can do that, right?
Because we have a lot of in churches at large, not my church, but in churches at large, there's a lot of elders who have children who are wild and disobedient. Yeah. So we do tend to pick and choose, but it's a hard question but for us, as you've already suggested, it's one I would have thought of it in that context, the divorce, but not in terms of a polygamy context, because in every state in the United States, polygamy is outlawed.
Right.
So it's just culturally not something we're going to address. I believe it's even outlawed in Utah, though it took them a while.
Yeah.
Because of this Latter-day Saints religion that's there.
Well, and I know for some in Zimbabwe, the issue is you have a man who has more than one wife and he becomes a Christian. What's he supposed to do? Is he supposed to choose one, divorce the rest? How do you handle that very difficult situation? And is divorce ever an answer to this kind of situation? I don't have all the answers to that for sure. All I know is going in, one man and one woman is the beginning of marriage and is the makeup of marriage. The rest of that, I'd really have to work on more, and we just don't have to deal with it. So it's not something I've done a lot of work on.
Yeah, the other, I've heard, I think it's becoming less so, but I've heard of ministers who a person becomes a Christian, they're married to a second wife, and they tell that person, well, they should divorce the second wife and go back to the first wife, which is just sheer ludicrous.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of, first of all, I don't think it's good biblical teaching.
I don't either.
Of all, it's just the social dynamics of it would be a nightmare. So the ideal
Right. There you
And
go.
3 is one husband, one wife. The Old Testament permission of it was not ideal, but was accommodation to the culture and to the social issues of their day.
And clearly, it caused problems in many instances, right? When there are multiple wives in these families, it often caused all kinds of problems for them, for their children, for the whole dynamic. So it's not like that ever seems really healthy, even in the Old Testament situations in which it was allowed.
No, John Ortberg wittingly said that the only punishment for having a second wife in the Old Testament is having a second wife.
Right.
and all of the social consequences we begin, you know, as early as with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar,
Right.
and then of course Ishmael. So and then you get to Isaac. I'm sorry, to Jacob,
Yeah,
his
sure.
grandson Israel. And then it really becomes a mess.
Right. All
And the
kinds of
family
problems.
dynamics there are, but out of that, God raises up 12 tribes of Israel, right?
Indeed.
So God can take even our human fallacies and use them to his good and to his
Right.
glory.
Right. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And I'm going to ask Dr. Brokaw to start on this one. Good question. Is the Sabbath day still important in our day, in our time? Good question.
It is a good question. And as Dr. Jones said,
There you go.
most of what everything really, I did a quick review of the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology articles on both the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. So we have the Sabbath coming in Genesis 2, 1 through 3, right? At the very beginning of creation. Sorry for not having it open to it. Thus the heavens and earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And then, so the whole principle of Sabbath is established in creation, God resting. Exodus 16, we have the story of the manna, and they are told not to collect on the Sabbath, to collect on the day prior double,
right?
So that they could continue to keep the Sabbath. Now that's significant to the extent that it predates Exodus 20, or comes before Exodus 20, in which we're given the 10 Commandments.
Right.
And so now we have the commandment here in Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. So the connection there to keeping the Sabbath is rooted in what? It's rooted in God's creative activity.
Right.
And then you have Deuteronomy, the second law, which is what the word means. And you have the recapitulation of the Decalogue, the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And this is what we find there as Moses is talking to the people, and he gives them the Lord, Hear, O Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today, learn them and be sure to follow them. And he connects it to the original giving of the law. And then beginning with verse 12, you have observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant. Right? It's significant because it includes even those who are not native born Israelites,
right,
who who are not part of the community of Israel, nor your ox, your donkey, any of your animals. So animals are to be given rest. Nor the alien within your gates, there's the foreigner, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that Yahweh your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God, Yahweh your God, has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So in Deuteronomy, how is the Sabbath, what is the Sabbath day connected? It's connected to God's justice and mercy, and to their being released from slavery in Egypt. Right. So in Exodus, it's connected to creation, and in Deuteronomy, it's connected to the need to bring about the kind of just community that God is interested in. Right. So there's punishments. I didn't write down all the scriptures, but you can read. There's a punishment. There's a man is put to death because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. The term Sabbath was used both of the specific day, the seventh day, and also of 7 days, meaning a week.
Right.
So the term was interchangeable for both. Well, then we fast forward to the New Testament, and we have this phrase that shows up only in Revelation 1:10. And please, brothers and sisters, it's Revelation, not Revelation. So I, John, your brother, this is verse 9. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind him a loud voice like a trumpet. Now there's discussion about what the Lord's Day means there, but most believe he's referring to the first day of the week. The Sunday, the day of the sun, comes to us out of Roman culture.
Right.
And it's not referenced very often as Sunday. In fact, I don't think it's referenced at all in the New Testament. I've already forgotten the note. But we have this expression, the Lord's Day. That's the only time it shows up in the New Testament is Revelation 1:10, and it's there. I believe it's the Hemera Kyriake. Later, it's kind of shortened to just the one word Kyriake, and by AD 115, so approximately 50 years after the time of Paul, depending how you date Revelation is
right.
Is,
yeah.
If you date it as late as 100, then we're talking about only a few years after. Some people, even Stephen Smalley, a really good John scholar, is dating it as early as AD 70. But by about 115, we have Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, writing, "No longer live for the Sabbath, but for the Lord's day." Then in the Didache, and this is dated approximately 120, though I've seen it dated even earlier than that. The Didache, it means teaching, the teaching of the disciples. It's not in our New Testaments, but it's an early Christian work. There's the command to assemble on the Lord's day. Right? Now, in the New Testament, that's the only time the Revelation 1:10 is the only time the Lord's day shows up. But we do have this reference to the first day of the week.
Right.
What happened on the first day of the week? The resurrection of Jesus. In Matthew 28:1, Mark 16:2, Luke 24:1, John 20, verse 1, all reference to the women going to the tomb or to someone going to the tomb on the first day of the week. This quote says that the early church customarily met on Sunday during the New Testament era cannot be unequivocally. In other words, another word? Without doubt, right?
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Demonstrated. But here are two New Testament references that suggest this was the case. So this is Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight.
And a long sermon almost kills somebody. So
yeah, I know. It gives me hope. But here we have what appears to be a reference to the church gathering specifically on the first day of the week
to break bread.
To break bread, which probably is a reference to the Lord's Supper.
Right.
Probably includes a community meal, the agape meal that we read about, but probably references first and foremost, I think, the Lord's Supper. And then here's Paul, 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. That seems to suggest, though, again, not without discussion, but that seems to suggest that the church was gathering on the first day of the week. Now, Paul could have just been saying, hey, set it aside the first day of the week and bring it sometime. But that does not seem to be the assumption.
Makes more sense.
It makes more sense.
Yeah.
So here, there's three distinctions in common Christian parley regarding the Sabbath. One is some believe Christians should observe the Jewish Sabbath. In our culture, I can't speak to African culture, that's most reflected in a group like Seventh-day Adventists, which meet on Saturday morning for their worship. There's those who have transferred the principles of the Jewish Sabbath in the Old Testament to Sunday. Sabbatarian is a word that's used. This is becoming less and less the case.
Yeah.
But in the United States, we had blue laws, what's called blue laws, which you could not shop on the Sabbath or on Sunday. And people refer to Sunday as the Sabbath, though it's not referred that way in the New Testament.
Right. And that's an important distinction, I think.
Yeah,
because
I think
it was
so.
almost assumed in our culture that Sunday was the Christian Sabbath. But to make a biblical case for that, to me, is challenging, to say the least.
I didn't see it in this article. It's my understanding from previous reading that honor the Sabbath is the one commandment from the 10, from the Decalogue, that's not repeated in the New Testament.
Right. Okay.
Which should give us pause.
Right.
It's interesting, when we came to Lexington, South Carolina in 1997, you could go into Walmart. This part of the videos presented to you by Walmart. You could go into Walmart, you could do grocery shopping, you could not do any shopping in the rest of the store.
Really?
It had like yellow tape up.
Really?
And sometime, I cannot give you a year, but those blue laws were taken off the book. And you can go into Walmart on Sunday morning just like you can come to church on Sunday morning. But yes, when we first came here, there were still blue laws. Dr. Phillips, one of my mentors from Emmanuel, talked about in the early 1950s, the move to do away with blue laws it wouldn't have been that early, probably sometime in the 1960s or 70s, I'm guessing. There was a move to do away with blue laws about shopping on Sunday, and the churches got together to fight it, and he said that ultimately all we did was give them free advertising.
Yeah.
And they did away with those laws. So yeah, even as recently as 25 years ago, those laws were still prominent here in South Carolina. And then finally, the third approach is that the Sabbath command was a part of the ceremonial law of Israel and not applicable to the church. And that's the most prominent and the one that you would find mostly in churches. It would be pretty much my response to it, that the laws that are given to us of the Sabbath in the New Testament are not applied or applicable to us. Now, I did not mention Either I skipped over or I didn't write it down, but you have instances of Jesus being accused of breaking the Sabbath. Now, in Jesus' case, he was very aware of the Sabbath. He wasn't really breaking the Sabbath. He was breaking the interpretation of the Sabbath that we have in by the New Testament days. So the last thing I would say on that, I know I went on a while, is, and I don't know if I ever answered the question yes or no, because I think it's a yes or no question, wasn't it? So I'll let you answer it yes or no. But 6 months ago or so, I was at my doctor, who does not attend my church. He grew up in a sister congregation, and he's pretty convinced that we should honor that we should worship on the seventh day, on the Sabbath.
Okay.
And he's part of another Christian denomination, and because he asked me, it was one of those out of those blue, what do you think about?
Yeah.
And I gave the answer, a much shorter answer, which is, well, Jesus was raised to dead on the first day of the week, and that seems to be the practice of the early believers, and that's how I summarized it. So,
I guess the only thing I would add to it, because you've covered it biblically well, is there anything that we can learn from the concept of Sabbath?
Yes.
And the concept of rest? And I think there is. I think there's value in that sense. There is a time for rest. And that's really what this was about, at the beginning, at least. As you said, and by the time of Jesus, it had become a very legalistic approach, and you could do this, you couldn't do this, you could walk this far, you can't walk any further, all these things that they had to keep track of. But is there value in appointing times for people to rest? And again, speaking from our culture, not Southern African culture, we're not really good at this, because there's a certain pride in never having time to rest. We're so busy we can't rest. We're always on the go, always doing this, always taking our kids there, always doing this for work. And it seems to me that God instituted something about rest being valuable for human beings, and we need to at least think that through. Now, does it have to be a certain day of the week, or I don't know about that, but there's value there somehow. And I'm not
I'm really glad you said that, because I didn't have it in my notes, but in my prior thinking to this, I did think that, is the Sabbath day still important today, is a twofold question.
It is, yeah.
Which I think I went through the biblical approach to it, and my end result would be, I don't think it's the day we're to worship.
Right, and I agree with that. Yeah.
But the larger principle is the concept of Sabbath, of rest, of worship, still important. And I think the answer to that is unequivocally, that's our word for the day, kiddos. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And it is important. Now, I'm lousy at it. But I also had, is Sabbath just cessation from work, or is it bigger than that? And we would say it's bigger than that.
Right. And that can be discussed.
It includes worship, Hebrews 10:25, which is probably larger than we make it. It's more than just about not showing up on Sunday. It's about leaving the flock altogether. But don't stop meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, so I think it certainly encourages us to worship. But going out with the family and playing at the park, or taking a vacation in our context, probably not in a Southern African context, but I think those are legitimate purposes. But I have friends who are very religious, Christian, ministers, this is my day off, or this is my family day. In a couple of instances, I can think of guys who wouldn't come to a minister's meeting because this was their set apart day. And I'm always like, well, you can move it to the next day. I don't think it should be that set in stone. Things come up, but
yeah. Okay.
Hopefully that's given my response was helpful.
Oh, I think so.
Again, it's all evangelical dictionary of theology.
Right. Okay. Next question. And I think we can go through this one a little quicker. What actually caused Moses to fail to reach Canaan. So he's leading the people out of Egypt, out of slavery, to the land that God has promised them, but he doesn't get to go in. And if there's one story in the Bible that frustrates my wife more than any other, it's this. She hates the fact that Moses only was allowed to look over into the promised land and never lead the people in. It stems from a couple stories, although that may be a bigger narrative than even I'm going to cover today. But in Exodus 17, the people need water, and God commands Moses, take your staff and hit the rock, and the rock will produce water. And that's exactly what happens. Then in Numbers, I may even have this. Let me see if it's okay. And then the second one, let me share my screen on this one, comes in Numbers, where we have a similar situation where the people need water again, and Moses is instructed to speak to the rock and it will produce water. Well, when the time comes, instead of speaking to the rock, he hits the rock. And this is the result, Numbers 20, verse 12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them. Because Moses hit the rock rather than spoke to the rock, somehow this implied a lack of trust in God and did not honor him in their obedience. Now, why did Moses hit the rock the second time rather than speaking to it? Well, here we're back to questions that I don't fully have an answer to. And why did God see that as a lack of faith? Well, I mean, it was a lack of obedience. Is it because Moses, I've heard people say this, Moses felt stupid speaking to a rock? And I mean, that does seem like a strange thing to do, but hitting a rock to produce water is maybe not equally strange, but nonetheless odd as well. Why did Moses do that? I don't know. I don't think we're given a clear answer to that. But what I do know is that God asked him to do something. He refused to do it. And this became an issue between him and God. Now, we might want to say, well, it seems like a small matter. Why would this keep Moses from entering the promised land? And it does seem like, well, couldn't he have just asked to be forgiven? Isn't there some way around this? But obviously it was important enough to God that this becomes the reason that he doesn't get there. Now, remember, Moses doesn't start leading the people out of slavery till he's 80. So he gets his full-time job when he's 80 years old. And he does that for 40 years. So by the time he dies, as he looks over into the land, he's 120. So, it might be time for him to graduate to something else. I don't know. But that's the way the story rolls. So why, I don't have an answer to. The what, which is the question, I think we're told. Okay, you want to add anything to that?
Here's Moses' response in Deuteronomy 3.
Okay.
He has told Joshua, he's kind of passed it over to Joshua. He says, do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God himself will fight for you. At that time, I pleaded with the Lord, Yahweh, O sovereign Lord. Probably Yahweh Sabaoth, but I'm not absolutely sure, but that's usually the way that gets translated. O sovereign Lord, you have begun to show to your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do the deeds and mighty works you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country in Lebanon. But because of you, the Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. That I've always been fascinated by this response of Moses.
Yeah.
That is enough, the Lord said. Do not speak to me anymore about this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and look west and north and south and east and look the land with your own eyes, since you are not going to cross this Jordan. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead this people across and will cause them to inherit the land that you will see. And then the very first verse of chapter 4, which is the next chapter, hear now, O Israel, the decrees and laws I am about to teach you. So I don't have a whole lot to add, except, and I was looking for that response. So if I missed something in what you said, I'll have to review it.
No, that's okay.
When the video comes out. But it's not just disobedience. It's that Moses puts himself on a par with God,
Fair enough.
right? And
Right.
he says, how long do we have to put up with you? And God, like he does to Job and others, says, ain't no we.
Right.
There's no we. Just, and God was willing to start over. You go to Exodus 32, and he
Sure.
says, I'm going to wipe the whole group out and we'll just
Right.
start over. But ultimately, God says, there's no we. It's me.
Yeah.
And maybe I think that's part of God's response, and we're all speculating because
Right.
the scriptural evidence is very vague. But I think the secondary kind of part of that is God is saying, all right, they are ready after 40 years of wandering to take the land. Yeah, you're 120 years old, time for you to pass the reins. But also, they need to realize that they have a new human leader, but I'm still their leader. And right?
Sure.
So it's time for you to come off the stage. You've performed your duty, but there's no we involved.
Yeah.
This is my job. This is my business. I don't want to put words in God's mouth. I guess I just did, but that's part of what I see.
No, I think that's fair.
There.
And however we answer this question, my wife will not be satisfied. I promise you.
I don't blame her. It seems a little unfair. But God called Moses for a specific task.
That's right.
And Moses didn't want the task. Go to Exodus 3. And God said, no, this is your job, right? I've got you ready for this. And his task was completed. And having been here 25 years, 26 years, you wonder, I do as a minister, at what point is my task complete? And if anybody sees this, as far as I know, I'm not going anywhere. But we all have a task, and it's to follow God and to try to carry out that mission the best we can.
Right.
We're not always as clear about that task as Moses was, but
maybe you and I will figure out what we're supposed to do by the time we're 80.
I don't really expect to be alive when I'm 80.
All right, here's a sort of a thorny question that brings up a lot of issues, and we're probably not going to be able to give a totally satisfactory answer to this one either, but we'll try to trace some things out. Okay, John the Baptist was in prison. We know that. Jesus was preaching. So John's in prison. Jesus is out. He's preaching. I feel like Jesus should have helped John, but his head was cut off, which is true. And it's sort of the question of, why didn't Jesus do something? The rest of the question reads this: Jesus was there. What was the significance of this? So we're talking about the Son of God, who has obviously incredible power to bring healing, to feed large numbers of people, is ultimately raised from the dead himself, has raised other people from the dead, including Lazarus. So why not John? Here's someone who has paved the way for him, who has led into his ministry, who he's related to, and Jesus does nothing for John. Why not? Okay, good question, but I think it brings up the bigger issue that we all deal with at times. Why does God allow suffering in general? Why doesn't God alleviate suffering? Why does God allow maybe someone that I love to face suffering or even death when we know he could do something about that? So this is the larger question of the problem of suffering in the world and the problem of evil. Why does God allow all of those things? Specifically John and Jesus, but I think it leads to some bigger questions. So that probably has a pretty simple answer that I'm going to allow Dr. Brokaw to give you.
Well,
this is no easy. I mean, there is no easy answer to this, and honestly, there's no satisfactory answer that we're going to give to this question and say, okay, well, there you go, it's wrapped up. Now you know the answer, because it's not there. I'll let Dr. Brokaw start, and I can chime in too. But
All right, let me.
The warning is we're not going to satisfy you any more than my wife on Moses and Canaan. So there you go.
Well, let me respond. I got thinking about this, and we did in some of our back and forth on WhatsApp discuss this whole issue about God allowing suffering, I think. Yeah. And I don't have that answer in front of me.
I don't either. Right.
I wish I did. We did address it some, and I think we maybe addressed it in the previous questions a little bit.
Right.
Let me talk about John, just some thoughts I had this morning, and unfortunately I didn't come up with the scripture references. John, from a human side of it, John gets swept up in political intrigue.
Right.
Right. We have this story. It's Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 3. I'll read Mark's version of it. For Herod, this is RSV, I think. For Herod had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Now, later we have John's, we're told the story of John's beheading, right? And I don't have that immediately in front of me, but the Gospels tell us later that there's this big party that Herod is throwing. Which Herod? Is it Agrippa or Antipas? It's Agrippa, right?
I think it's Agrippa, yeah.
Yeah.
That's in Mark 6 as well. It's all right there.
Okay. Do you have that?
Yeah.
Go ahead and read that. I was turning there, but I wasn't.
Okay. So we begin in verse 17, I guess. There's more to it, but Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom. She went out and asked, and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist, she answered. At once the girl hurried in to the king with a request. I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb.
So what we have is John getting sucked up into political intrigue, right?
Because of his preaching.
And God allows it.
Yep.
Right. We get sucked up into forces of injustice. We, meaning people, Christians, get sucked up into forces of injustice and etc. Why does God allow that? He does. We don't know, but it's part of the human condition.
Right.
The interesting thing is, so does Jesus. From a secular historian approach, Jesus gets sucked up into the same kind of political intrigue. I mean, the religious leaders want to keep the peace. Right? They want to keep not only peace, they want to keep their status. And, I just got last week was reading in John as part of my 2-year Bible reading that this situation where the religious leaders bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate. And he was like, why are you bringing this? And they we need him dead. We can't put him to death. And Pilate says he hadn't done anything to be dead. Right? He gives Jesus an opportunity to respond. Jesus says, this is out of your hands. This is out of your hands. And Pilate, in order to keep the political peace, well, I mean, Jesus means nothing to him, right? So he has him crucified. The difference is Jesus is, of course, raised from the dead.
Yeah.
And the difference is we believe it was part of God's plan for redemption. So God wasn't caught, surprised by this. And then I'd go to Matthew 11 as one place where, so that's part of it, but go to Matthew 11. This strikes me as well. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" And Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." And my primary point in reading that is to point out what John does not ask for. John does not ask for Jesus to get him out of there.
Right.
He does not ask for Jesus to get him out of this mess. What he wants to know is, are you really the Messiah?
Right. And I would add a couple things to that. One, you mentioned, of course, this happens to Jesus, but he's raised from the dead. And I mean, the hope that we have as followers of Jesus is that John will be raised too. And that's the ultimate justice that we find here is that we have to look for, is that this is the same destiny for both. Jesus is firstborn from the dead, and John will follow. And to take what you just said about John and to stretch that over into the life of the church, Acts chapter 4, we have Peter and John, is it, who are arrested?
Mm-hmm.
And they come back, they're released. They come back to the church. What do they pray for? That God will never allow us to be arrested for our faith again. No, that God will allow them the courage to keep preaching. And that's always struck me, that they don't pray for protection, they pray for boldness. And that seems to be John doesn't ask for protection, he doesn't ask for release. He just wants to know the truth about Jesus. So, the early church, these early followers of Jesus may have been asking different questions than we're asking.
Let me say one more thing on that regard, which is just Ephesians 6:19. Paul's in prison.
Right.
Rome. Who knows?
Right.
Ephesus. Because I think Ephesians was a circular letter. That's my opinion. Pray also for me, that whenever I open my mouth, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel. And I quoted this last week, so that's why it's so fresh to me. He does not pray to get out of prison.
Right.
He prays to preach the gospel.
Right. And we see that in Colossians 2. Paul's looking for opportunities for ministry, even though he's in prison.
Yes.
So that's a consistent theme. So again, not
I
entirely...
have one final thought on,
on
John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Sure. And sorry, this comes from Acts 19.
Yeah.
While Apollos was at Corinth, Paul took the road through the interior and arrived at Ephesus. There he found some disciples and asked them, "Did you receive the Holy Spirit when you believed?" They answered, "No, we have not even heard that there is a Holy Spirit." So Paul asked them, "What baptism did you receive?" "John's baptism," they replied. All right. Paul said John's baptism was a baptism of repentance. He told the people to believe in the one coming after him, that is, in Jesus. I don't, well, I'm going to speak for God, but I have no idea if this factors into it. But we have 20 years after Jesus, after John's death, John still being a major figure among some people.
Right.
And maybe God is clearing the stage by allowing John the Baptist to be beheaded. He could have done it different ways, I'm sure, that maybe part of the purpose of God is from that point on, there's no question about who the main focus should be should be on, and that is Jesus.
Yeah.
Again, I mean, I don't. From our perspective, and you just covered this, it seems a little unfair. Same thing with Moses,
Yeah.
but in God's purposes, that's not the primary point. The primary point is Jesus anyhow, and because of Jesus, we're all promised resurrection life.
Yeah, and that's our hope. So that's where we got to look. Okay. I want to go to the next question, but I want to hit this one pretty quickly, and then move on to the last question, which might take us a few minutes, and we're going to run out of time soon. So this question is, where can we say today these countries are in the land of Canaan? So if we look at, I got a map I want to show here. If we look on the left-hand side at the land of Canaan divided up into the tribes, this is Israel. We look on the right-hand side, a more modern map, and I don't know what year this is. I should have looked at that. But anyway, because of course these boundaries do change over time. So we can see that it was basically the nation of Israel, the modern nation of Israel, but the West Bank is there. The West Bank of the Jordan, that is what we're talking about. That includes, Palestinians, and then you move to the east of the Jordan, and then you're in now the modern nation of Jordan. To the north is Lebanon. To the northeast is Syria. That would have included some of what was then Manasseh in the ancient world. And then to the southwest is, of course, Egypt, where they came to Canaan. So it's pretty easy to look at a map and see the modern nations. And again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because you can probably get some of that available to you on the internet as well. But those are the nations that we see basically. And as we've said, that changes. We didn't have a modern nation of Israel till the 40s, but now we do. So anyway, okay, there we go. I'd rather spend a little more time on this last question. I'm confused about the New Jerusalem. Is it in heaven or here on earth? And the answer is...
I've really enjoyed. I've enjoyed our time together. Thank you very much.
Oh, my answer at least is yes.
Yes.
Which is not an answer, right? They're not the answer that you want to hear. But I would say, and what I would really like for you to do is to spend some time looking at the last 2 or 3 chapters of Revelation in more detail, because we don't have time to cover all this. But at the beginning of Revelation 21, I would say this is the beginning of your answer to the question. Verse 1, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven, the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband, and heard a loud voice coming from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Okay, so it goes on from there. So is the New Jerusalem in heaven or on earth? And the picture that I see painted there is that the holy city comes down and is among us, but God is dwelling among us. So there's no need for a temple in the New Jerusalem because God is among his people. And I mean, even that little bit gives us, in some ways, an answer to the question about John, right? That this again is our hope. This is, and for Moses too, this is our hope. This is what we're looking forward to, that God will be among us and that we will be in the presence of God for eternity. And the rest of the book, the rest of 21 and 22 goes on to describe this in more detail, but in symbolic and, really just painting a picture with words. So I'm careful about, is there really going to be ruby streets? Well, that's the way it's described, but I think what we're being told is this is beyond our imagination, and the author is telling us this is pretty incredible stuff. Maybe that's exactly what it's going to look like. But I think that the point is, it's beyond what we can really see now. The main issue for me is we're in the presence of God. Okay, that's not complete, but it's a start. Dr. Brokaw.
Well, Jerusalem, Revelation 3:12, the church in Philadelphia is told, "Him who overcomes, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will he leave it. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on him my new name." So early on in Revelation, you have this kind of foreshadowing of this image at the end of the letter.
Right.
And Paul references the church as the Jerusalem of God. The only thing I would add, and I'm probably muddying the waters, is just this. You and I have had this discussion many, many times, and over the last 5 or 6 years, due to our conversations, due to my own reading, due to some influence from N.T. Wright, I've kind of I've changed the way I reference. For instance, if someone were to die, rather than, I would say he is with the Lord, he or she is with the Lord, from Philippians 1, which Paul says is better by far. Perhaps I might say he's gone to the place Jesus has prepared for them. They have gone to the place Jesus has prepared for them, John 14. I'm not as, or I might even say they're awaiting the resurrection.
Right.
From 1 Thessalonians 5. I'm slower to say they're in heaven. My wife and I, your wife's not happy about Moses. My wife's not particularly grateful for that wording, especially in she lost her mother 4 years ago, and she likes thinking of her being immediately in heaven. And you have both languages used in the New Testament, but I think the emphasis is on the resurrection and God taking this earth. What is it N.T. Wright says? It's not so much about us leaving earth to go to heaven as it is about bringing heaven to earth.
Right. And he'll say heaven's great, but it's not the end of the world. And that, I mean, his point is heaven comes and fills creation. All of creation is filled. I mean, heaven for him is the present, that is God's dwelling place. And this picture in Revelation 21:22 is of God and his dwelling place filling all of creation. So we don't necessarily go to heaven, but God comes to us and heaven is among us. But, again, I'm not an expert on this. The book that I think Tim's referring to that has been formative for both of us is the N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, which I don't know that you would have available to you, but if you ever get a chance to get your hands on it, I would encourage you to read it, because I think he makes a biblical case for what we're trying to talk about. And it really, it's not just from Revelation 21:22, but I think that's the beginning point that he uses as well.
And you have said that in your early background with the a cappella churches, that there was more emphasis on this kind of
Absolutely.
thing. Yeah. And I had much less influence on that. And
right.
I don't want to go throughout my history, but I wouldn't say I've changed, but I have morphed. I've to a little bit different thinking. It's another word for more, but to change, but it just more continuity in terms of my thinking and moving in a particular direction. A friend of mine, and I wish I could remember the exact wording the little girl used, but several years ago, his daughter's now a teenager, but when she was 7 or 8, he had an aunt die, and they were apparently somewhat close. And his little girl prayed, and I can't get the wording exactly right, but she said, "God, we thank you for Aunt Susie, or whatever. I don't know if she's with you in heaven now, or if she's waiting the resurrection, but either way, we believe that she'll live forever," or something like that. And I said, boy, that for a 7 or 8 year old, you got that right.
Yeah,
Because
pretty
language,
good.
the Bible uses both, the New Testament uses both images. So
Yeah.
lastly, I talk less about heaven and more about eternity than I used to. It's different. It's nomenclature, but it's the one that I've adopted. Now, you'll hear me reference heaven in a funeral, or I'm not so stringent on it that I don't use some of the language interchangeably.
Right. Good. Okay. I think that's all our questions, and I hope that it's been helpful to you. And we will see you next time.